Good evening, everybody. Welcome to VOLKSVOORBEREIDING. That means Volk Prep in English. Today, I received an interesting message from our big communal group about hyperinflation or inflation coming to our society. And could hyperinflation be the fall of our modern society and the collapse thereof? And I'm going to read you an article that says Twitter and Square CEO Jack Dorsey says hyperinflation will happen soon in the US and the world. It says the Twitter co-founder and crypto advocate Jack Dorsey weighed in on Friday, escalating inflation in the US, saying things are going to get worse. It will happen in the US soon, and so the world, and so they onto the world, he tweeted. It says Twitter and co-founder Jack Dorsey weighed in on escalating inflation in the US, saying things are going to get considerably worse. Hyperinflation is going to change everything, Dorsey tweeted Friday night. It's happening. The tweet comes in with consumer price inflation running near the 30-year high in the US and growing concern that problems could be worse than policymakers have anticipated. So that is very interesting that one of the richest people in the world, men in the world, and considered one of the elite, would say something like this. Now, what hyperinflation will do is pretty much it increases the cost of living. And that means that your financial status will lower. For instance, if you are very rich, it won't really affect you that much because you will probably stay in the category that you are. But if you are in the higher end of middle class, you will probably go down to middle class. And if you're in the middle class, you go down to the lower end of middle class. And if you are, for instance, where I am at the lower end, the bottom end of middle class, and you will go down to a bit of the more to lower class or to the struggling class, more into the poverty line. Let's call that below the breadline. Most of us, probably, especially you guys watching this channel as well, we are in the middle class. And in my 13, 14 years of being a prepper, I have learned that in our community, or the prepper community, especially in South Africa, most of us are at the poverty line. We are not at the high, like the low end of poverty class. We're not like the worst of the worst, but we are still struggling and we are barely making meat in at the end of the month. And what's going to happen especially is when the cost of living goes up, people are going to cut down on certain things. I call this the luxury perspective. Restaurants, entertainment, tourism. So the first thing people do, especially when things get really tough, is they cut down on luxuries. Especially the first thing is usually your restaurants. I used to be a waiter for many years, and especially a few years ago with the recession. And those of you who are working as waiters who are watching this will definitely conclude that last year and this year was a very tough time for you guys, because just because by the laws and the regulations being put in, but by people cutting down that. And then obviously what happens as well is the entertainment industry. People don't usually go to bars to watch shows, or they don't go to concerts anymore. They have to cut down on those costs. And in the tourism, people don't go on vacation, they tour anymore. They stay home and they try maybe go out and do something close by. They have to cut on those costs. Now, when the society collapses, or when everything gets expensive and people go more into poverty, what's going to happen is people are going to get desperate because, as we just said, people cut costs in certain areas, and those people will probably much become unemployed. And the more unemployed a country becomes, the more desperate people become because of joblessness. When people become desperate, their behavior changes. You will see an increase in crime, especially stuff like theft and attempted hijacking. And neighbors will try and start disorientate each other. So it will lead to totally economical collapse. Now, when the economy collapses, it becomes a total political thing, because as an example, here in South Africa, every time there's a situation, there's a political feud between a minority group and a majority group. As usual, the majority group, who is not all but majority-wise, general-wise discussion, is part of a more primitive or an indigenous third world culture, and the minority, who are pretty much keeping the tax bracket alive or being blamed for a lot of things. So usually when and at a time when everything collapses, there will be a political feud and people will start pointing fingers and blame, and then there will be usually action. So a economical collapse will lead to a political collapse, and even the other way around, like a political collapse will lead to an economical collapse, because when there is a political feud between people, the economy collapse. People don't go to work, people can't go to work because of, example, looting, like in Natal in July, or they start blocking the food trucks. And so when the inflation goes up, cost of living goes up as well, and people become desperate and they become poor, which is one of the examples. That's why it is so important. If we looked at the previous videos I made about why it is so important to become self-sustainable and do homesteading, grow your own food, grow your own crops, livestock, and also to get out of the cities, because when tough times come and when things become more expensive, it's usually the more popular, dense areas that are hit first, because usually the most of the restaurants, and the retail departments, and then the entertainment industries are mostly at the populated areas, because that's where the money are. People in the countryside usually don't do this as much. They are pretty much mostly working on the farms in the countryside. So people who have time on their hands in the city areas do these things. So when times becomes tough, people will again start looting, and then everything will collapse, and then the entire, let's call it the violent situation in those areas, will definitely become more dense. So can or could inflation or hyperinflation become or be the coming of the fall of society and collapse of it? It may be. It won't happen necessarily instantly, like a political or a economical thing, or like, for instance, the power grid of the system goes down. Political can be quick as well, like we saw in Natal as well. Usually the inflation will happen over time, but the hyperinflation, which is pretty much inflation on steroids, can mean a lot of things that will happen. So that's why it's important to become self-sustainable, to get out of the cities. And hyperinflation or inflation can thus be a fall or a collapse of society. That's why it's so important to, while you still have chance, to prepare for coming situations. Buy food, buy resources, get skills, do plans, because even if you do not have a lot to offer or to trade, if you have skills, you can use your skill and trade with your skill for something else. And that way you can build a community and become stronger together. So yeah, while you have time, guys, if inflation becomes a really big problem, which it definitely is, because there are signs that inflation is going up, or maybe another recession is on its way. While you have time, while you have finances, get as prepared as you can to make it easier for yourself when this time comes and you need to cut down on things. You are already first used to the lifestyle, and you are not stressed and pressured to change and to cut as much as other people will. It would obviously change their behavior. So prepare yourself while you still have time, before inflation might or could happen. Use the resources and the financials you have still, if it's possible. Not everybody of us can. Some of us can a lot, some of us cannot. But there's always somewhere you can cut, and like cigarettes and going out, and liquor, all those things, just an example. So prepare yourself in for a situation like this coming, so that you can be better prepared, better planned, and better orchestrated when a time like this comes. I'll see you guys in the next one. As always, protect yourselves and look after yourselves. Goodbye.